The image of a charming prince, adored by crowds and wrapped in the glamour of the crown, has now been shattered. The man who once walked through palaces as if they were stages for his polished public act has been stripped bare by the voice of someone who knew him far too well. The truth is no longer hidden behind the royal smile or the ceremonial titles. One of his former maids has come forward, and her words are impossible to ignore. What the public once imagined as noble and elegant is now exposed as petty, cruel, and deeply entitled. Stay with us until the end, because what she reveals doesn't just paint a different picture of Prince Andrew. It uncovers a reality that many suspected, but few dared to say out loud. He didn't suddenly become a monster over time. No, the rot had been there from the beginning. What you're about to hear proves that his arrogance and cruelty were not accidents of adulthood, but traits woven into his character from the start. Her name is Charlotte Briggs, and like so many young women with hopes of working in the royal household, she once dreamed of honor, respect, and the pride of serving the monarchy. For Charlotte, stepping into that world was supposed to mean a chance to be part of history, to live among people she had been raised to admire. She believed that service to the royals was a calling, that devotion and kindness would be recognized and perhaps even appreciated. She thought the man she was assigned to would reflect the grace and nobility the crown so carefully projected. But what she quickly learned was that no amount of loyalty, no amount of patience, and no amount of kindness can transform someone who thrives on making others feel small. She would later say that trying to nurture him with respect was like warming a snake's egg. No matter how much you protect it, it will only hatch into a snake. When Charlotte was only 21, she was pulled into Prince Andrew's inner circle, into a household that seemed to promise elegance and prestige. Buckingham Palace itself was a symbol of grandeur, and the position she had been given was considered an honor among her peers. But it didn't take long for the shine to fade. She would later admit that the job she once believed was a dream became a nightmare no one wanted. It wasn't because of the long hours or the demanding schedule. It wasn't because palace service is grueling. She had been prepared for that. It was because of the man himself. Behind the polished walls, Andrew was not the Duke of York the public cheered for. He was something else entirely. His staff didn't whisper about his generosity or kindness. Instead, they traded stories of his arrogance, his mood swings, and the way he could turn a normal day into a minefield of insults and tantrums. In her interviews, Charlotte didn't hold back. She didn't soften her words or attempt to preserve the illusion of royalty. She spoke bluntly, cutting through the mythology that shielded him for years. She admitted openly. She didn't care what Andrew felt anymore, because the truth was more important than protecting his image. To her, he was nothing more than a nasty, horrible man who thrived on treating others badly. This wasn't bitterness or exaggeration. It was the raw voice of someone who had endured years of humiliating service to a man who saw himself above everyone else. And the world listened, because in her testimony there was a ring of honesty no amount of royal PR could bury. Her earliest memories of working under him were not of a noble prince at all. They were of a man who was lazy, spoiled, and quick to anger over the smallest of things. Andrew would bark orders for tasks so trivial they bordered on absurd. Curtains became one of his greatest obsessions. Imagine heavy drapes that he could easily draw with his own hands. But to him, that wasn't his job. It was Charlotte's. One evening, she failed to close them all the way, leaving the faintest sliver of light. To anyone else, it would be insignificant. To Andrew, it was grounds for rage. He stormed from his room, his footsteps echoing down the corridors until he found her, and in a voice laced with profanity, he shouted that she couldn't do anything right. The humiliation was crushing. She was reduced to tears, not because of curtains, but because of the cruelty in his voice. This wasn't a single outburst. It was a glimpse into daily life for those who served him. In Andrew's world, mistakes weren't forgiven, no matter how small. Everything came with the threat of punishment. Maybe not physical, but psychological, the kind that chips away at you slowly. Charlotte recalled moving through the palace with the constant fear of being noticed by him. To catch his eye was to invite anger. She admitted that she often did everything she could to avoid him altogether, hoping that staying invisible might spare her from his unpredictable temper. His presence was suffocating, his moods impossible to predict. Working in his household was like walking on eggshells, knowing that the wrong step could shatter everything. But the temper wasn't the only thing that made him unbearable. It was the strange, obsessive demands he placed on those around him. To the public, quirks like his fondness for stuffed animals might seem eccentric or even amusing, but to the staff forced to maintain them, it was torture. Prince Andrew had an elaborate collection of teddy bears and plush toys, and they weren't just scattered about for comfort. They had to be arranged with military precision, each one placed exactly according to laminated instructions that dictated where each bear belonged, who flanked the bed, and which ones stood in the back. Charlotte was trained for hours on this ritual alone. She knew that a single mistake, a toy out of order, a bear slightly tilted, could trigger another explosion. What does it say about a man that his staff had to spend their energy arranging stuffed animals rather than carrying out meaningful duties? His bedroom was less the chamber of a prince and more a shrine to his fragile ego. Pillows had to be aligned with perfection, pajamas laid out symmetrically, and the bears removed and replaced according to a bizarre daily ritual. To Andrew, these weren't trivial things. They were tests of loyalty and submission. To Charlotte and her fellow workers, it was another layer of humiliation, another reminder that they weren't seen as human beings but as tools for his comfort. And so, while the world admired the public version of Andrew, the smiling royal, the Duke of York, who represented tradition and charm, the people who actually lived with him saw something darker. To them, he was petty, cruel, and impossible to please. For Charlotte Briggs, the teddy bear ritual was only one piece of a much larger nightmare. Every day brought with it the pressure of trying to anticipate Andrew's moods, which could change in an instant. She described life in his household as like walking into a storm without an umbrella, unpredictable, hostile, and always ending with someone getting soaked in his rage. The curtains, the toys, the pajamas, these might sound like small things, but they carried with them outsized consequences. What made it worse was how unnecessary it all seemed. Unlike his brother Charles, who bore the heavy burden of preparing for kingship, or Princess Anne, who worked relentlessly on behalf of the crown, Andrew had no real responsibilities weighing him down. His role was ceremonial, his schedule far lighter than his siblings. Yet somehow, he demanded more, expected more, and gave less than anyone else. The staff, including Charlotte, often wondered why a man with so little to do carried himself with such entitlement. They weren't simply assistants, they were prisoners of his moods. Other royals were known for their quirks as well, but the difference was how they treated the people around them. Charlotte would later say that even Prince Philip, known for his bluntness, still showed courtesy and respect to those who served him. Charles and Edward were demanding, but they acknowledged their staff as human beings. With Andrew, there was none of that. He treated them as disposable, as if their only purpose was to bow to his ego. This was not Charlotte's bitterness alone. Other palace workers echoed the same experiences. One former maid told of being ordered to dash across the room to close curtains that Andrew himself was standing next to, not because he couldn't do it, but because he wanted to remind her of her place. Another described how he would greet staff with condescension so sharp it cut through even the most mundane tasks. Even polite exchanges were laced with coldness, making it clear that he saw them as beneath him. These weren't isolated moments. They were patterns, repeated so consistently that they defined him in the eyes of everyone who worked close to him. The tragedy in all this was not just his behavior, but how unnecessary it was. Andrew was not a man overburdened by duty or stress. He was not navigating the impossible weight of being heir to the throne. He wasn't even known for intense public service. His life, compared to his siblings, was lighter, freer, and more indulgent. Yet instead of showing gratitude for this privilege, he weaponized it. He used his position not to uplift, but to belittle. He seemed to relish humiliation, as though making others feel small was the only way he could feel big. And this is where Charlotte's testimony becomes more than just gossip. It pulls back the curtain on something darker. The idea that cruelty was not incidental for Andrew. it was essential. He didn't lash out because of stress or pressure. He lashed out because he wanted to. He enjoyed it. This was not a man pushed to cruelty. This was a man who chose it, who leaned into it, and who made it part of his daily routine. Charlotte herself admitted that working in his household drained her of dignity. She began each day not with pride in her service, but with dread of what was to come. The palace, which should have been a place of beauty and tradition, became a cage. She and others who served there walked on eggshells, constantly rehearsing tasks in their heads to make sure they didn't spark another eruption. Imagine living in an environment where you're not afraid of doing something wrong, but of simply existing in the wrong way. That was life under Prince Andrew's roof. The press, once shielded from these truths, eventually caught wind of these stories. Tabloids seized on the teddy bear collection, mocking him as a grown man clinging to toys and tantrums. But for Charlotte, there was nothing amusing about it. To her, these weren't funny quirks. They were weapons of control, designed to remind staff that even the smallest detail had to be about him. What the world laughed at, she had lived through as misery. The contrast between Andrew's public charm and his private cruelty became harder to ignore. On state visits, he smiled, bowed, and carried himself with the dignity of a royal. Cameras captured him as the Duke of York, a man who represented tradition, stability, and grace. But those who lived with him saw a different figure, one who raged at curtains, demanded obedience over toys, and reduced his staff to tears. The gulf between image and reality was enormous, and when Charlotte finally spoke out, the world realized just how deep the deception went. And this wasn't just about staff grievances. It was about the culture Andrew created around himself. He didn't lead his household with respect or even indifference. He ruled it with arrogance and cruelty, creating an atmosphere so toxic that people dreaded going to work. To the outside world, palace service was an honor. To those assigned to Andrew, it was a punishment. His household wasn't remembered as glamorous or prestigious. It was remembered as unbearable. What made this testimony sting even more was the contrast with other members of the family. Staff compared him not to strangers, but to his own relatives. While Charles was exacting but thoughtful, while Edward was courteous, and while Philip was blunt but fair, Andrew was in a class all his own. His treatment of staff didn't reflect a man under stress. It reflected a man who saw cruelty as his right. To him, courtesy was weakness. Demanding respect was not enough. He needed subservience, but Charlotte's revelations didn't stop at his adult behavior. She insisted that this wasn't new. She claimed it was rooted in something deeper, something that went back to his earliest years. To her, the man she served was not someone corrupted by power over time. He was someone who had always been cruel, who had always relished dominance even as a boy. And when she began to speak of his childhood, the stories that surfaced painted an even darker portrait, one that suggested Prince Andrew was never the charming prince at all. He was, from the beginning, something far less innocent. From the very beginning, those who knew Prince Andrew as a child remarked on something different about him, and not in the way one might hope. While Charles was the quiet, thoughtful son who often retreated into books, and Anne was spirited but capable, Andrew seemed to stand apart for far less admirable reasons. Even as a toddler, there were whispers among palace staff that his temper burned hotter, his demands were louder, and his sense of entitlement was stronger than anything they had seen before. He wasn't simply mischievous or strong-willed. He was cruel. And unlike other children who might grow out of their tantrums, Andrew seemed to lean into his, wielding them as weapons to control the adults around him. One of the earliest examples came in his interactions with the Queen's guards. For most children, those towering men in their rigid uniforms and solemn silence were figures of awe. But not for Andrew. Instead of shyness or respect, he saw them as toys for his amusement. He would strut past them, pulling faces, mocking their stillness, trying to provoke them into breaking their composure. When they remained stone-faced, he grew angrier, escalating his antics in hopes of forcing a reaction. To some, it looked like the bratty stubbornness of a spoiled child. To others, it was something darker, the beginnings of a boy who believed no rule applied to him. not even the disciplined silence of the men tasked with protecting his family. But it wasn't only people who felt the sting of his spoiled temper. Animals, too, were subjected to his cruelty. Stories began to spread among the palace staff of Andrew kicking at the family's dogs, laughing when they yelped, and striking horses with sticks for nothing more than his own amusement. For those who worked with the animals, this was horrifying. The cruelty wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, repeated, and gleeful. Eventually, one group of royal grooms decided they had seen enough. In a moment that defied every royal protocol, they took matters into their own hands. When Andrew lashed out at the horses again, they seized him, shoved him headfirst into a pile of dung, and buried him in the filth. It was a punishment born not of malice, but of desperation, a hope that humiliation might teach him the lesson he refused to learn. And that wasn't the only time palace staff stepped beyond protocol to discipline the young prince. On another occasion, after relentless taunting of a palace footman, Andrew pushed the man past his breaking point. The footman, unable to take another insult, lashed out and struck the boy, leaving him with a black eye. In any other circumstance, such an act would have meant immediate dismissal. But when the footman offered his resignation, the queen herself refused to accept it. Even she seemed to understand that Andrew's behavior had gone so far beyond normal childhood mischief that discipline, even harsh discipline, was not only deserved, but necessary. That moment spoke volumes. It revealed that even within the royal household, Andrew's behavior had crossed lines that no one else's had. His cruelty wasn't confined to staff and animals. Within his own family, he sought dominance. With his younger brother Edward, every interaction became a contest. Andrew wasn't satisfied with simple brotherly teasing. He went further, snatching cakes away, shoving him, leaving him with bruises. This wasn't playful roughhousing. It was domination, a boy intoxicated by the thrill of superiority, always needing to prove that he was in control, even at the expense of his own siblings' happiness. To outsiders, it may have seemed like sibling rivalry, but to those inside the palace, it was another reflection of a boy who thrived on power, who treated cruelty not as a mistake, but as entertainment. At school, his reputation followed him like a shadow. At prep school and later at Gordonstown, classmates saw him for what he was. They gave him nicknames: Baby Grumpling for his constant tantrums, and the Snigger for his habit of laughing at others' misfortunes. Where others tried to blend in, Andrew seemed to delight in standing out, but not for achievement, intelligence, or charm. Instead, he became known as spoiled, smug, and cruel. Teachers and peers alike recognized that he wasn't the charming royal many hoped for. He was a brat, through and through, carrying himself with the arrogance of someone who had been told his entire life that rules did not apply to him, and as he grew older, the behavior didn't fade. It hardened. What might have been excused as childhood mischief transformed into adolescent cruelty. Stories circulated of him at palace events, yanking the zippers of female staff members' dresses as they worked, laughing at their discomfort. He shoved their faces into plates of food, jeering at them to smell it, treating dignity as something to strip away for his amusement. These weren't harmless pranks. They were humiliations, inflicted by a boy who had grown into a teenager but never shed his taste for cruelty. On camping trips and outings with his peers, Andrew's need for dominance turned once again into sabotage. He tore down the shelters of other boys, tossing fly sheets into rivers and leaving his companions soaked and miserable. Where others saw shared hardship, Andrew saw opportunity for control. His laughter at their suffering revealed exactly the kind of person he was. Not a leader, not a companion, but a bully. To him, causing misery was a form of sport. The staff who worked around him summed it up best. Andrew didn't carry himself with the polite formality expected of a royal child. He didn't ask. He demanded. He barked orders laced with profanity, tossing objects to the ground and commanding servants to pick them up, as though testing how far he could push them. To the men and women accustomed to discipline, restraint, and dignity, his language was shocking. They saw in him not the mischievous innocence of a child, but the tyranny of someone who had been told yes too many times. Someone who believed power gave him the right to trample others. And so, by the time Andrew entered adulthood, the pattern was already set. He was not corrupted by fame or warped by responsibility. He was simply allowed to grow into the person he always was, arrogant, entitled, and cruel. The stories from his childhood reveal not a boy who lost his way, but a boy who never had one to begin with. By the time Andrew reached adulthood, it was clear that the patterns of his childhood had not softened with age. The arrogance, the cruelty, the sense of untouchable privilege, all of it remained, only now cloaked in the trappings of a man who believed himself above consequence. Where some royals took their positions as a duty, Andrew treated his as a license for indulgence. He entered the Navy, where discipline and courage were expected, and for a time he wore the uniform with pride. But even here, stories emerged of a man less interested in service than in status. He relished the attention, boasting of his daring during the Falklands War, but colleagues often remarked that his vanity outshone his valor. For Andrew, even military service became a stage on which he could perform the role of a prince, not necessarily live up to its responsibilities. His charm, shallow as it was, drew women into his orbit. Tabloids gave him the nickname Randy Andy, splashing his image across front pages with stories of his romances and late-night escapades. For a while, the public laughed it off. He was young, handsome, a bachelor prince who enjoyed the privileges of his station. But beneath the glamour, there were whispers of something less innocent. Friends spoke of his dismissive attitude toward women, treating them as ornaments rather than equals. Waitresses, models, and companions who crossed his path often left with stories of crude remarks, inappropriate advances, and a man who believed his title excused anything. It wasn't simply playboy behavior. It was entitlement, sharpened into exploitation. Marriage did little to temper him. When he wed Sarah Ferguson in a spectacle of royal pomp, many hoped that settling down might ground him. For a time, it seemed as though it might. The couple had daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, and for brief moments, Andrew seemed to step into the role of family man. But old habits die hard. His arrogance persisted, and his marriage soon unraveled under the weight of scandal. Fergie's own controversies made headlines, but Andrew's behavior behind palace walls, his temper, his demands, his philandering, were never far from the whispers of those who knew him best. Their divorce became yet another chapter in the ongoing saga of a man unwilling to change. It was in the decades that followed, however, that Andrew's darker associations began to draw scrutiny. He cultivated friendships not with upstanding figures, but with the rich, the powerful, and often the dubious. Among them was Jeffrey Epstein, the disgraced financier whose name became synonymous with scandal and exploitation. Andrew's connection to Epstein was not passing. Photographs, flights, and accounts placed him firmly within Epstein's inner circle. He was pictured strolling in Central Park with Epstein even after the financier's conviction. And when questions arose about his relationship with Epstein's victims, Andrew's explanations only deepened the suspicions. One woman, Virginia Giuffre, came forward with damning allegations, claiming she had been trafficked to Andrew as a teenager. Her account was chilling, detailed, and unrelenting. The palace denied, Andrew denied, yet the evidence mounted. A now infamous photograph of Andrew with his arm around her waist, alongside Ghislaine Maxwell, contradicted his claims of never meeting her. And when he finally sat down for a televised interview to clear his name, the world watched as he delivered what would become one of the most disastrous interviews in royal history. With every word, Andrew dug his own grave. His bizarre explanation that he could not have been sweating because of a medical condition was mocked mercilessly. His insistence that he had been at a Pizza Express on the night in question became a punchline. What was meant to be a defense transformed into a public relations catastrophe. In that single interview, Andrew revealed himself not only as evasive, but as absurdly out of touch, incapable of recognizing the gravity of the allegations against him. The arrogance that had defined him since childhood now appeared grotesque, leaving the public horrified and the monarchy humiliated. The fallout was swift and brutal. Charities and institutions severed ties with him. His military titles and royal patronages were stripped. Even the Queen, his most loyal defender, was forced to acknowledge the damage he had done. For a man who had grown up believing himself untouchable, the reality was devastating. He became a pariah within his own family, rarely seen in public, his presence at royal events considered a liability. His daughters, once proud of their father, faced the weight of his disgrace. The press, which had once called him Randy Andy with a wink, now referred to him as Disgraced Andrew, his reputation shattered beyond repair. And yet, those who had watched him grow were not surprised. The man who had mocked the guards, who had struck animals, who had humiliated staff, had simply become the man the palace staff always knew he would be. His arrogance, unchecked, had matured into recklessness. His cruelty, ignored, had evolved into scandal. The story of Prince Andrew was never one of a good man gone astray. It was the story of a boy whose flaws were excused, whose misdeeds were overlooked, whose sense of entitlement was allowed to fester until it consumed him. In the end, Andrew's fall from grace was not sudden. It was decades in the making, the inevitable conclusion of a life lived without accountability. He had always believed the rules did not apply to him. But when the truth finally emerged, through headlines, through interviews, through the voices of those who had suffered, he discovered that even a prince could not outrun consequence forever. Today, his legacy is not one of service or valor or even charm. It is one of disgrace, a cautionary tale of what happens when privilege breeds arrogance and arrogance breeds ruin.